The food system that fed empires for 3,000 years, then disappeared. What if the most efficient food system in human history wasn't lost, but quietly ignored? For over 3,000 years, civilizations used a method that produced more protein per acre than modern livestock, without chemicals, without industrial feed, without massive infrastructure. It fed empires. It sustained villages for generations. And when 20th century scientists tested it, they confirmed it worked. Then it disappeared from Western agriculture almost overnight. Not banned, not disproven, just set aside. Why would a system that outperformed industrial farming at a fraction of the cost never scale? And who benefited from the silence? This is the story of the food system that history remembers. But modern policy forgot. The story begins long before written history. It passes through the courts of emperors, the notebooks of medieval travelers, and the research stations of mid-century American scientists. And it ends, if it ends at all, in a question that modern food systems researchers are only now beginning to ask seriously. What did we lose, and why? This is the history of polyculture aquaculture. And the further you follow it, the stranger the silence around it becomes. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, in the river valleys of what is now northern China, something was happening that had no name yet. The Yellow River flooded seasonally, as it always had, and when the waters pulled back, they left behind shallow depressions filled with trapped fish. Neolithic farmers in the region, already sophisticated in their management of rice paddies and millet fields, began to notice a pattern. The fish in those depressions didn't die. They thrived. They reproduced. And if you deepened the hollow slightly, reinforced the edges with packed clay, and left them alone, they would still be there months later. This was not aquaculture. Yet, it was closer to what ecologists today would call passive management, working with the behavior of a landscape rather than against it. But it was the beginning of something that would eventually become one of the most sophisticated biological engineering systems in human history. By the time of the Tang dynasty, roughly 1,600 years before the Common Era, fish ponds had become integrated features of agricultural estates. Oracle bone inscriptions, the earliest form of Chinese writing, carved into animal bones and turtle shells, contain references to fishing in enclosed garden spaces. Archaeologists interpret these as evidence of managed ponds attached to both aristocratic estates and common farming plots. The wealthy kept ornamental varieties, farmers kept working ones, and the working ponds maintained by ordinary families were producing protein at a scale and efficiency that would not be matched in the Western world for another 2,000 years. The key species was the common carp, hardy, fast-growing, tolerant of low oxygen environments, capable of surviving conditions that would kill most other fish. Carp had been the backbone of Chinese pond aquaculture for centuries. Entire regional economies were organized around them. And then, in the 7th century of the Common Era, an emperor made a decision that changed everything. The Tang dynasty came to power in 618 CE under Emperor Gaozu, whose family name was Li, phonetically identical in spoken Mandarin to the word for carp. Whether out of genuine superstition, political symbolism, or simply the kind of imperial caprice that absolute power occasionally produces, the farming of common carp was prohibited across the empire. The fish that had anchored Chinese aquaculture for over 1,000 years was suddenly off limits. What happened next is one of the more remarkable examples of adaptive innovation in agricultural history. Farmers didn't abandon their ponds. They couldn't afford to. Protein was survival. Instead, they began experimenting with species that had previously been considered secondary. Grass carp, which fed on aquatic vegetation near the surface. Silver carp, which filtered microscopic algae from the middle water column. Bighead carp, which consumed zooplankton. Mud carp, which foraged along the bottom sediments. Each species occupied a distinct ecological zone. None of them competed directly with the others. Together, they formed a layered system in which every level of the water column was being productively utilized, and the waste produced by each species became a resource for another. This was not planned. It emerged from necessity. But what the Tang dynasty farmers had stumbled into was a functional model of what modern ecologists call a multi-trophic system, an ecosystem in which energy and nutrients cycle continuously between organisms at different levels of the food web, with almost no waste leaving the system. Contemporary agricultural researchers who have studied reconstructed versions of these systems have found that multi-species polyculture ponds can produce between 2 and 4 times the protein yield of single-species systems, using the same water volume. The Tang dynasty farmers didn't have the vocabulary of modern ecology, but they had arrived at the same conclusion through direct observation. Diversity was not just aesthetically interesting, it was structurally productive. By the time European travelers were documenting Chinese civilization in the 13th century, village fish ponds had become so ubiquitous that they were described as a defining feature of the rural landscape. Some had been in continuous productive operation for longer than most European nations had existed. They were producing thousands of pounds of protein annually, without purchased feed, without veterinary intervention, and without the kind of intensive labor that European livestock farming required. The travelers noted this. They wrote it down, and then, for reasons that are worth examining carefully, almost none of it made it into Western agricultural practice. Part of the explanation is straightforward. European settlers who arrived in the Americas brought with them a deeply ingrained livestock tradition, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens, that was culturally familiar and already embedded in existing trade and land use systems. A productive pond that managed itself through biological complexity didn't fit easily into that framework. In a culture that equated agricultural productivity with visible human effort and control, a system that worked best when you left it alone was difficult to categorize as farming at all. But there's another layer to this history that is less frequently discussed. If you're finding this history as compelling as we do, go ahead and share this video. It helps more people find content like this, and we have a lot more of it coming. In the early 20th century, as industrial agriculture began its rapid expansion across North America and Europe, there were researchers who did study traditional polyculture systems. They published findings, they documented yields, and in several cases, their work pointed clearly toward the conclusion that small-scale integrated pond systems could produce more protein per unit of land than conventional livestock operations, at a fraction of the cost. One of the most significant bodies of this research came out of Auburn University in Alabama. Fishery scientist H.S. Swingle and his colleagues spent decades studying pond aquaculture systems beginning in the 1940s. Swingle built experimental ponds, some as small as 1,000 square feet, and tested various combinations of species, fertilization methods, and stocking densities. His results were consistent, and in retrospect, striking. Well-managed small ponds, using techniques that drew directly on the principles of traditional Chinese polyculture, produced yields that compared favorably with ease, and in some cases exceeded, conventional livestock production on equivalent land areas. Swingle's research was published in peer-reviewed journals. It influenced aquaculture programs in several developing countries. But in the United States itself, the research generated relatively little policy response. No major extension programs were built around it. The knowledge existed in the academic literature, and it stayed there. Understanding why requires looking at the broader context of mid-20th century American agriculture. The post-war period was the era of industrial consolidation. Livestock production was scaling rapidly, supported by government subsidies, cheap grain from mechanized farming, and a processing and distribution infrastructure that was becoming increasingly centralized. The economic logic of the system pushed strongly towards standardization and scale. A backyard pond that produced 200 pounds of fish per year was not a unit that fit into that logic. This is not a coordinated effort. It is something more mundane, and in some ways, more interesting. The systematic prioritization of one model of food production over all others, driven by economic incentives, institutional inertia, and cultural assumptions that were rarely examined explicitly. The result was that by the latter half of the 20th century, most Americans had no practical knowledge of pond aquaculture as a food system. The idea that a modest water feature could function as a self-sustaining protein system, one that had fed civilizations for 3,000 years, had become almost entirely invisible in mainstream agricultural culture. But the biology hadn't changed. The nitrogen cycle that makes polyculture ponds work is the same today as it was in Neolithic China. Fish produce ammonia as a metabolic waste product. Beneficial bacteria convert that ammonia, first into nitrites, then into nitrates. Aquatic plants absorb those nitrates as fertilizer, growing rapidly and filtering the water in the process. Zooplankton and insects feed on algae and decaying plant matter. Fish feed on zooplankton and insects. The cycle closes, Energy and nutrients move continuously through the system, and very little escapes as waste. Waterfowl have been integrated into these systems across multiple independent agricultural traditions. In Chinese polyculture, ducks were considered essential biological managers, not incidental additions. Their foraging behavior stirs bottom sediments, releasing bound nutrients into the water column. Their waste adds nitrogen directly to the system. They consume insects, aquatic plants, and surface organisms, preventing any single element of the ecosystem from becoming dominant. Research into integrated duckfish systems has consistently found that the presence of waterfowl in a pond increases fish yields by measurable margins, while simultaneously reducing the need for supplemental feeding. Aquatic vegetation plays an equally critical role. Cattails are among the most efficient biological filters documented in ecological research, so effective that constructed wetlands using them are now used in wastewater treatment applications in multiple countries. Floating plants like duckweed absorb nutrients so rapidly that under optimal conditions, they can double their biomass in less than 48 hours. Modern researchers have found that duckweed contains between 25 and 45% protein by dry weight, comparable to soybeans. The ancient farmers who integrated it into their pond systems didn't know its protein content in percentage terms, but they observed that ponds with abundant duckweed tended to be more productive than those without. They were working empirically, and their conclusions align closely with what modern nutritional science has since confirmed. This brings us to a question that the historical record raises, but doesn't fully answer. How did these systems survive at all, given how thoroughly they were marginalized in Western agricultural development? The answer, in part, is that they never fully disappeared in the regions where they originated. In China, integrated pond-dike farming systems, in which fish ponds are surrounded by raised dikes used to grow vegetables, mulberry trees, and other crops, have been in continuous operation for centuries. In 2017, the Pearl River Delta version of this system was recognized by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a globally important agricultural heritage system, a designation that acknowledges both its historical significance and its continued relevance as a model of sustainable food production. Similar systems developed independently elsewhere. Medieval European monasteries maintained fish ponds, known as vivaria or stew ponds, as a reliable protein source for communities that observed regular fasting days when meat was prohibited. These ponds were carefully managed, with separate compartments for different species and life stages. The knowledge of their construction was considered valuable intellectual property. In Hawaii, native Hawaiian communities constructed sophisticated fish pond systems, known as loko'ia, along coastal areas, using stone walls to create enclosed lagoons that trapped juvenile fish and allowed them to grow to harvestable size. Some of these systems date back over 1,000 years. At their peak, Hawaiian fish ponds are estimated to have supplied a significant portion of the protein consumed by the island's population. Many fell into disuse following the disruptions of the 19th century, but restoration efforts are currently underway at several sites. The independent development of sophisticated aquaculture systems in China, Europe, and Hawaii, and in other regions including Southeast Asia, West Africa, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, suggests something important. These systems were not accidents. They were not curiosities. They were convergent solutions to a universal problem. How do you produce protein reliably, efficiently, and sustainably from a limited land base? Every culture that solved this problem arrived at similar answers. Enclose water, introduce multiple species, integrate plants and animals. Let the biology do the work. The specific species varied by region. The construction techniques varied by available materials, but the underlying ecological logic was consistent. Across thousands of years and thousands of miles of separation, that convergence is, in itself, a form of evidence. When independent civilizations arrive at the same solution without contact with each other, it suggests that the solution is not culturally contingent, it's biologically correct. If you want to keep following questions like this one, the kind that sit at the intersection of history, science, and the choices that shape the world we live in, subscribing to this channel is the best way to make sure you don't miss what we uncover next. Modern food systems research has been grappling seriously with the question of sustainability for several decades. The environmental costs of industrial livestock production, land use, water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, antibiotic resistance, are well documented in the scientific literature. Researchers looking for alternatives have increasingly turned to integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems that echo the principles of traditional polyculture. A 2019 review published in the journal Reviews in Aquaculture concluded that these systems represent one of the most promising pathways toward genuinely sustainable protein production at scale. The most sophisticated food production systems that modern ecology can design look remarkably like the systems that Chinese farmers were operating 2,000 years ago. This is not a coincidence. It's a rediscovery, and it raises a question that historians and agricultural policy researchers are beginning to ask more directly. What would the trajectory of global food production have looked like if these systems had been taken seriously in the 20th century rather than marginalized? These are genuinely open questions. We can't know what a different set of agricultural policy decisions in the 1950s would have produced by the 2020s. But we can observe that the knowledge existed, that it was documented, that it was studied, and that it was not acted upon at scale. Fan Li, the figure referenced in early Chinese aquaculture texts, sometimes dated to the 5th century BCE, is often cited as the author of the Yang Yu Jing, a treatise on fish farming, considered one of the earliest systematic documents on aquaculture in any culture. Whether the text was written by a single author or represents a compilation of accumulated knowledge is a matter of scholarly debate. What is not debated is that the methods it describes were sophisticated enough to remain relevant for centuries after they were written down. A document describing food production methods from 2,500 years ago is still being studied by agricultural researchers today, not as a historical curiosity, but as a source of practical insight. The knowledge was never wrong. It was simply set aside. Why that happened, and whether the current revival of interest in integrated food systems represents a genuine shift in agricultural thinking, or simply a niche trend, is something that researchers, policymakers, and farmers are still working out. The answers will depend partly on economics, partly on policy, and partly on the cultural assumptions that shape which kinds of knowledge we treat as worth preserving. What the historical record makes clear is that the silence around these systems in the 20th century was not inevitable. It was a choice, a series of choices, made by institutions and individuals operating within a particular set of incentives and assumptions. Those choices had consequences, and those consequences are still unfolding. The fish ponds of the Tang dynasty didn't disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared from Western consciousness because the systems that replaced them were louder, more visible, and more compatible with the economic logic of industrial scale. But the biology is patient. The nitrogen cycle doesn't care about market structures. Duckweed doubles its biomass every 2 days, regardless of commodity prices. Carp grow in still water, whether or not anyone is paying attention. The question that the history of polyculture aquaculture ultimately leaves us with is not a technical one. The technical questions have largely been answered, and the answers have been consistent across centuries and continents. The question is a cultural one. It's about what we choose to remember, what we choose to study, and what we choose to build. 3,000 years of evidence suggests that the most productive food systems are also the most ecologically integrated ones. Systems in which diversity is not a complication, but a mechanism. In which waste from one organism becomes a resource for another. In which the role of the farmer is less to impose order on nature than to create the conditions in which natural order can express itself productively. That idea is not new, it's ancient, and it's still waiting to be taken seriously at scale. Whether it will be is a question that the 21st century has not yet answered.